I think the delivery of bad news is one of the most important skills for a lawyer. A client, I was junior, who was facing murder, manslaughter, 2 kidnappings and 12 specimen rapes. We engineered a plea, which the Crown accepted, of guilty plea to all the charges except murder, all over the press, and a whole life tariff. And going down to the cells to see him afterwards, talked to a gentleman who was never going to be released.
Welcome to the Ridgemont podcast. This is John Wallace of Ridgemont. I'm managing director of the firm. We're specialists in construction and real estate law. And I'm sitting here with Graeme Sampson of Lamb Chambers, who's a specialist construction and planning barrister.
People often say, how can you represent the guilty? It's not just the guilty, it's the unpleasant, the dishonest.
Yeah.
Those people who, certainly if you were brought up nicely like I was, never really dreamt existed. Then you realise half of them are your relatives. And that even the people who commit the most serious crimes have some personal value. And the challenges of being a lawyer and an advocate are numerous. Do you know the most difficult case I ever did? One short advice, which was for a mother and father whose daughter had suffered liver failure. And her only chance of survival was a transplant. And she had gone onto a waiting list. But they had been informed, quite rightly, that the waiting list was such that she would almost certainly die before one became available. And they came to me for advice on what could be done to effectively move their daughter up the list.
Yeah.
And the answer is nothing. And that is incredibly difficult advice to give. On one level, it's the easiest. But on an emotional level, how do you tell a mother and father there's nothing they can do?
It's incredibly sad. And that is a difficult client, but clients can be difficult in other ways too, can't they? So you have those who refuse to answer emails, those who, when you ask for instructions, don't provide them, those that send you their papers so disorganized that you have to spend hours, days putting everything together. We have clients who appear to be willing to not only lie to me, but lie to a judge, which never goes well. And I've seen that in court where a client has strayed from their statement, and certainly from the evidence that they gave to me when they were briefing me on the statement. And that takes a particular type of person to be willing to lie in order for financial gain. Certainly not how I was brought up and how I'd be prepared to behave.
I think the greatest shock for me when I became a barrister as a pupil, going to court and watching other members of chambers in court, was a simple mystery. I was always in trouble at school and I was good at misbehaving, but I was always honest. And what shocked me was watching a parade of otherwise respectable adults go into the witness box, swear on the Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and then proceed to lie casually, easily, and enthusiastically. And very often both sides lying at the same time.
We also have clients come to us, and no doubt we've had them in front of us when we've both been in conference with the same client, who are not prepared to or can't listen to the advice. Either normally it's because they don't like the advice and so they choose not to hear it. And that is frustrating for a lawyer, but also devastating for them because they're going to go down a road which is not going to end well for them.
You can only do so much for a client. Certainly on my part, I would always try and give the correct advice and the appropriate advice. If a client chooses not to take it, that is a matter for them. And that's their difficulty. If they choose not to take my advice, that's also their right. They're not compelled to do so, as long as they understand the consequences.
How does it make you feel when a client doesn't take your advice?
Slightly sad because normally they're putting themselves in trouble.
Yeah.
Um, and you have to ask yourself, why are they not taking my advice? Have I put it badly? Have I explained it badly? Should I try again? Normally, if they don't take your advice, they're doing that for a good reason. Generally, because it's negative about the possible outcomes of the case. And they can't or don't want to face up to the fact they may have lost.
And that's a really important skill for any lawyer, be it solicitor or barrister, is the ability to tell a client that they don't have a claim. You see it in the courts. You see it in correspondence from opposing solicitors, where clearly the solicitor hasn't properly advised their client of the prospects of success of their claim. And one of the skills that we need is to be able to look our client across the table and say, "You're not going to win."
I think the delivery of bad news is one of the most important skills for a lawyer, ranging from one end, and one of the more dramatic moments in my legal career, which was a client, I was junior, who was facing murder, manslaughter, 2 kidnappings and 12 specimen rapes.
Wow.
And we engineered a plea, which the Crown accepted, of guilty plea to all the charges except murder. So guilty to manslaughter, kidnapping, rape, all over the press, and a whole life tariff before such things were openly expressed in court. And going down to the cells to see him afterwards, and I've been down to see hundreds of clients in the cells, and indeed I've been to see clients who had been given life sentences. But I was with my QC leader, who I knew well, and the solicitor, who I knew very well, and talked to a gentleman who was never going to be released. Far better than the old days, of course, when he'd have been hung.
Yeah.
But my silk dealt with it beautifully and just said to him to remember that life goes on, but life will be different.
He was found guilty of terrible crimes, but he was going to prison for the rest of his life. He would die in prison. How did that make you feel as his advocate?
I was sad for him. He was actually quite a nice chap. He had an appalling life as a child. He had enormous psychological problems. So on one level, one felt some human compassion for him. But equally, and to be fair to him, he recognised this, bearing in mind he pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
He couldn't be trusted on the outside. And to put it bluntly, he couldn't be trusted in the presence of women.
Yeah, sure. I've only ever been down to the cells once because I've never practiced criminal law. But one of the managing director of one of my clients was convicted of serious fraud, and one of his preliminary hearings was at Southwark, and there's cells under Southwark. Is that right? I think there is. I think it's down there. I remember going down to see him. It's the first opportunity that I'd had to take instructions from him on the civil matters that I was dealing with. I remember how small the cell was. I remember the thickness of the bars, the coldness of the metal down there. It was dark. But at the same time, when those fluorescent lights were on, it was so bright that it was difficult to see. He looked very small in the cell, even though it was a small cell, because he himself was no longer had the bravado. He was vulnerable, and I remember feeling intimidated by the place.
I think the cells are extraordinary. Of course, Southwark, they're posh and new. The Old Bailey, the cells there could obviously tell a story or two. Probably the most appalling cells I remember going to were I think of the old Marylebone Magistrates Court.
Yeah.
Enormous high brick pits, which were just awful places. I always thought the one thing I wouldn't like about a cell is that when you look at the door, there's no inside handle.
There's no way out.
Yeah. Although my two particular cell war stories. One was when the AIDS epidemic first started, being asked to represent a man at Horseshoe Road, I think, who had AIDS. And the magistrate, stipendiary magistrate, wouldn't allow him to be brought into court.
That's crazy.
So we went down, her, the prosecutor, me, and conducted the hearing at the cell with the door open.
I mean, that must have been awful.
Which I obviously protested. But that felt a travesty.
Yeah.
The other was going to Highgate and asking to see my client in the cells and being told that I probably didn't want to do that. I said, well, obviously I have to see him in this. I wasn't po-faced about it. I'm a pragmatist. But I said, yeah, I've got to go and see him. And to be informed by the sergeant that he had conducted a dirty protest from the cell. And I decided that, in fact, I could speak to him at the back of the court when they cleaned him up and brought him up.
When it goes wrong at trial, and I'm thinking specifically of your former life in criminal law, but it applies also to construction proceedings, and judgment goes against you, and you turn and you look at your client, what goes through your mind?
Hopefully I told you so. Because one generally likes to think that you've got your advice right. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's on a knife edge who is believed.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do about that apart from put your best case forward.
How does it make you feel?
I always want to be sure that I've done the best I could. And sometimes, to be honest, you're not sure that that's the case. There cannot be an advocate out there who has not at some point thought, was there anything I could have done differently?
Yeah, for sure.
I remember as a pupil meeting the Silk who had represented Derek Bentley, the Let Him Have It fame. And we were having quite a pleasant conversation. And that obviously came up, as I dare say it did with every student barrister and that particular Silk. And he said he still thought of it and wondered if there was anything he could have done differently.
Really?
And I'm very glad that I was of a generation when the death penalty had been abolished.
Yeah. I mean, so a question I was going to ask you to finish off this podcast was, so losing a trial, it happens. Sometimes you just get a bad judge, Graeme. It's not your fault. And that brings with it disappointment. But actually what lawyers carry with them throughout their careers is stress, because I think there's only surgeons who have to meet the same level of being right 100% of the time. And that obviously is a stress that lawyers have to learn to live with, because if you couldn't do the job. I suppose I'm interested in how you've dealt with that stress over your career, the requirement that you must be right.
I don't think I see stress in quite the way most people do, because I've thought about this question. I have never felt under personal pressure. Been threatened a couple of times, but I've been cool about that. But I've always been confident that I'm doing my best. May not be right, but I'm doing my best. The stress we are under as a barrister is not the public speaking. which people often think it is because they get too nervous to speak in public.
Yeah.
But once you've done it the first couple, it's like riding a bicycle. It's the fact that you have to be the decision maker all the time. Ever since I was called to the bar, I've sat with clients, often with solicitors who are more experienced than I am. And they have said to me, what do we do? So I've had to make those decisions.
And they're big decisions that affect their businesses, their lives.
Life-changing decisions. So you're taking those decisions all the time.
Do you think solicitors are guilty of being too submissive in those conversations?
Yes, I think that but I always invite the solicitors, I hope you feel I do, to take part. Their view is as valid as mine. But they are important decisions. You said earlier about a surgeon. I don't see the role of a barrister as nearly as stressful. Funnily enough, I was having a conversation recently with a cardiac consultant surgeon. And we were talking about stress.
Yeah.
And he was saying, oh, well, we're all the same, consultant surgeons and barristers. I said, no, we're not. We have a court of appeal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have to mop the blood off me when I come out of court. I regard the stress they're under as far, far greater.
Well, one of my friends from uni became a doctor, and I think this is the case that when you're training to be a doctor, you have to do 6 months in A&E as a trainee, essentially. And so he was doing this, and it was horrendous because he had all sorts of stories and various things stuck in various places, which we won't mention. But one of the things that he spoke to me about, and I asked him was, so when people die, how do you cope with that? And he said to me that you have to leave it at the hospital, otherwise you wouldn't be able to live or function. And I guess that's the difference, isn't it? That when they make a mistake or when something goes wrong, regardless of whether they've made a mistake or not, it is final, and it's literally a matter of life and death.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we never have to face, save for the fact that there are those jurisdictions which still have the death penalty.
Yeah.
And I say now, I couldn't have appeared in a capital trial. I dare say if the death penalty had existed, I would have done.
Yeah.
And I would have coped with it, as no doubt people did. But I think the immediate stress, the medical stresses must be far greater. And my son was a very large baby and was delivered early by caesarean section, but was told that he would have been a 12-pound baby.
Wow.
And so I was remarking upon this to my mother, who was a district midwife in Glasgow in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Cycling around with her bag of drugs, delivering babies in filthy tenement blocks. And that's why I have this funny Scottish spelling of Graeme. And she delivered a 12-pound baby naturally in a Glasgow tenement.
Well, that is incredible.
Now, the stress on a 5'2", early 20s district midwife of performing that operation is far in excess of anything I will ever do.
I think I agree with that. Thanks, Graeme, for joining us for this podcast. It was really interesting, and I'm sure our listeners felt the same. If anyone would like to contact Graeme, if they've got any legal questions or they're interested in anything that he touched on today, then you can email him on graemesampson@lambchambers.co.uk. That's Graeme, Graeme. Equally, if you enjoyed the podcast and don't want to miss the next one, or you want to hear about any construction or real estate law news, then subscribe to our newsletter by emailing contact@ridgemont.co. See you next time.